Here's an easy tree painting for you in watercolor. This is Kerala, a state on the southwest coast of India. Thanks very much to Ravi, a friend of mine on Patreon, for the kind sharing of the source photo. So an easy tree, a very dominant tree. I'm not sure what sort of tree this is. Maybe it's a hardwood tree, a mahogany or something like that. If anybody, if there's any tree expert out there, maybe they can let me know in the comments what sort of tree this is. But a lovely tree. Look at all these twisty branches. I'm not sure if this tree is just beginning to come into new foliage, whether it's discarded the old foliage or if it's stressed in some way and it's dropped its leaves, but we can see right through the canopy, almost like a deciduous tree in winter in the northern hemisphere, a deciduous tree. And yeah, all of these twisty, gnarly branches. We've got that one there, that one there, like a fork. So in drawing a tree, just take a few minutes to observe the form of the tree, the shape of the canopy. This is like a sort of dome, like a mushroom in a way, but it's not a entirely smooth perimeter to it. There's some little sort of indentations where it's like a sort of jagged edge to it, and then there's a little bit of a lean to the main trunk. Well, let's look at the other elements of the picture. A nice sky, easy sky to do. Plain blue, coming slightly lighter towards the horizon. In the distance, we've got some, I think they're different types of trees. Certainly they're palm trees here, tropical. This is a tropical area of the world. So we've got, I guess, coconut palm trees here, a few different types, a couple of different types. That's a different one there. So a few palm trees in the distance. On the left-hand side, quite a complicated house, quite a complicated building with the architectural details, a bit of red, this sort of portico triangle above the windows, a satellite dish there. Not sure if I'll include that. The light's coming from the left, so it's casting a shadow mainly on the right-hand side, I think. Well, being a tropical area, I guess the sun is very high right above us. Or actually, the sun might be just slightly above us, because look at that bicycle, that motorbike. And the shade, we can see there the direction of that light there, with the shadow being cast on the ground. So light almost right above. This, I think, is a timber yard or sawmill or something like that. So there's all this, I think this is hardwood, maybe teak or mahogany or something like that. Maybe not freshly cut. These trees here, it's shedding its bark there. But on the left-hand side, we've got these quite long, chunky logs. The actual cross-section of them, they're not a perfect circle. They've got a little bit of this one here is almost like a rectangle in a way, with some sharp corners. So there's a pile of logs, long logs on the left, then maybe shorter ones on the right. There's not too much foreground here, but we've got a sort of dusty, muddy foreground to contend with. Lots of things going on in the distance. Don't really know what's going on there, but there is a distant log pile. There are also foliage, maybe some distant buildings, but that's in the distance, so we want to keep that simple. On the right-hand side, there's a couple of sheds, and we can partially see through these sheds. Inside the sheds, I guess there could be some machinery for cutting up logs, perhaps preparing them. We can see some timber boards here that have been processed. So I guess that's the finished item from these works here. And then on the right, yeah, these shorter logs, all sorts of different sizes. So things we've got to think about here: composition, trying to get the balance of the tree. Actually, the photograph is a good composition as it is, but I'm going to move the horizon up a little bit. The horizon for me is just a little bit too low. There's too much happening in the bottom half of the picture. So I want to move the horizon a bit more up there, and then have those logs on the left-hand side. These trees, the sheds would be up there somewhere, and then the logs on the right-hand side. Still get the tree roughly in there in the picture. Got to make sure it's not touching the top of the picture. I want a bit of sky. I want a bit of sky in there as a bit of a gap, or a border, if you like, from the tree up to the top of the paper. And colour-wise, well, there's lots of greens and earthy browns and reds. So these sheds, for example, we can only just see a small bit of the right-hand side. I'm tempted to actually imagine these sheds are turned around a little bit so we can see more of the right-hand side of the shed, the right-hand side of the roofs. I think that would work quite well on the right-hand side there. Value-wise, well, where is the lightest part of the picture? Well, there's little bits of sunlight hitting the building on the left-hand side. That will be quite light. The darkest areas are within the sheds, and a nice bit of contrast. The darkness of the sheds and the tops of these logs here, and then the gaps between the logs as well. I mean, looking at that gap there, just think about shapes. You know, so we've got if I was drawing that shadow within the gaps between the logs, it'd be like that. So that all that would be dark, for example. A few logs have got a little bit inside them within the middle of the trunk. Some things, whether that's a natural thing with these old trees, maybe that's why they've been felled. So there's a little bit of pattern, but I don't want to go overboard on the detail of the rings on those logs and some of the cracks on the logs. Not sure about the motorbike. Maybe keep that out. No figures as well. So let's see how we get on. Paper I'm using is Saunders Waterford. It's 300 grams, 15 by 11 inches, quarter imperial, and taped down with some masking tape. First step is for me to do the outline drawing, and the tree, I want to get that right. So I've started by just creating the arch of the tree. You might not be able to see all of the lines I'm drawing in here. I'm not actually pressing down hard on the pencil, just to keep it nice and soft, just to see a few of those lines coming through. Because when I go over the sky, the canopy is going to be quite light. I don't want a solid line to be that semicircular solid line to be there. So just a little bit of like a dotted line for the canopy, and then a few of the major branches, the tree trunk, trying to suggest the curvature of the trunks and the twisty nature of some of the branches. So just the main ones. And Background, very simple. Palm tree, one of those coconut palms. Maybe have another one top right corner. Get a little bit of a balance to those, position those trees. And another little one in front. Couple of trunks. And then for the two sheds, starting with the left-hand one, so the ridge of the roof, two sides. Now the right-hand one, just a tiny bit bigger. We can see a bit more. We can see a bit more of the right-hand side. As I say, I've just going to twist. I've twisted those sheds around a little bit, just so that we can see a bit more of the light hitting the rooftops. And then the far end of those rooftops. I'll have some dark foliage behind. Then we've got a horizontal support, a few verticals there, the side walls, the corner posts, and a start of these logs. So the top edge of the log pile. And I'm not drawing in, on this right hand side, I'm not drawing in every single log, but just a few of the ends, little circles, just to define the ends of those logs. Maybe a little bit bigger, these closer to us. Now thinking about perspective, they are slightly pointing down. We're above the height of those logs, so they are sloping up a little bit, and over to the right, the angle may be a little bit less angle compared to the horizontal, but just a slight incline of those logs. Couple more in there, a few more in there, down to the ground. And then on the left-hand side, there's some larger, bigger diameter logs, I think. So top one here, and then the bottom one. And the end. There'll be dark shadows in between these. Another one on the left-hand side. Little one underneath, dark shadow in between those two. Perhaps the suggestion of some more wood on the left, going further over to the left, and then in the middle there's a really tiny pile of logs in the distance. Is there an important feature of this painting? I'm trying to get the log shapes right before I get to the painting stage. Within the sheds, we can see through to the back of the shed, see through that, but there's machinery and planks in there. another little palm tree. And now coming over to the left, there's this quite complicated building. So this is the, what I think is the, well, I don't know whether it's the front or the side, but the main side that's facing us. And there's a few, well, it's about 3 or 4 floors high. So just think about the perspective a little bit. And then there's another side coming out at right angles. That's the roof. Side. And then a shrub or something, big, medium-sized tree on the left, framing that side. Some sort of building just beyond the house and behind the tree trunk. The pencil I'm using is a 3B, so it's a soft pencil, and it's going to make lines dark enough so I can see what I'm doing, just in case I lay down some thick paint. Obviously with watercolor it's fairly transparent, so we can generally see through it, but just in case I went quite thick on the sky, just emphasized a few lines, particularly of the trunks. Strengthen up some of these lines on the house as well, and then there's a ridge beyond the house. Not sure if it's part of this building or another building. But if you're doing this yourself, those people on Patreon, you can change that building on the left-hand side, make it a lot simpler. I think if I did this again, I'd probably just have a simple shape in there on the left and not bother with all the balconies. It's not the main focal point is either the tree or the angle of the logs pointing towards the shed, so that could be a focal point. Maybe the motorbike or a figure somewhere in the middle, that could be another focal point. The tree, let's see, the house on the left, don't want it to be too overly done. Right, that was the drawing stage done. Now to painting, and I'm layering some clear water on the top part of the picture because I do want a nice even wash. I don't want to show any brush marks, so pre-wetting the paper will help me here. And if you're using good quality watercolor paper, this won't damage the surface, especially if you're using a soft brush here. So I'm using a soft mop brush just to lay out an even layer. And you can see it gradually soaking in. I'm just beginning to lose the shine on the paper. Painting in all different directions. The paper is buckling a tiny bit. It doesn't matter. The main thing is to have an even layer. Make sure the water has had a minute or two to soak in before painting. And yeah, it's got to be even. So I don't want any, if the paper does buckle, I don't want there to be any little puddles forming in the dips in the paper. Right, so first colour is going to be cerulean blue, a little bit of lavender. My palette from the very top is neutral tint, burnt umber, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, viridian green, cobalt green, cerulean blue, which I'm using here primarily for the sky with lavender. And then below cerulean blue, I've got cobalt blue, then ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, Windsor red, light red, cadmium orange and lemon yellow. And then running over to the right hand side, I've got that lavender. Pre-wetting the paper then helps me lay down an even wash. Well, this is going to be a graded wash, so it's going to be darker at the top and a little bit lighter down towards the bottom. And while it's still quite damp like this, I can go in thicker at the top, going right over the edge of the paper, over the masking tape, and then come lighter down towards the bottom. If I don't get that graded look, I can still apply some thicker paint. No water here, just using the same brush, just picking up pure pigment, and then the top portion, add on another layer. This is all still quite damp, still quite moist. So gently with those horizontal marks, just gradually bring it down. Let's add on another layer on the top portion, just to make it a tiny bit darker compared to the near the horizon. Just lightly touching the surface. Now continuing on with the lower half, and as I normally do, I try and cover up, on this first wash, try and cover up most of the paper, apart from those areas that are going to be either bright white, like the rooftops of the houses there, or any object that I want to pay some special attention to. So I'm just applying this sort of dominant colour, or the dominant warms down in the lower part of the picture, with the logs and the foreground. All the warms, the cadmium orange in my palette, the reds, the light reds, and over to the right hand side. So now it may appear just a little bit too bright, like that red there, but things will dry a good bit lighter, so I'm having to go a bit stronger. There's the rooftops of the two sheds, carefully down to the back of that right one. Let's cool it up a tiny bit on the right hand side. I picked up a tiny bit of a cerulean blue. Then continuing on with the rest of the logs and the area down to the bottom right corner, keeping with this warm theme, these ochres and reds. And painting right up to the edge of the paper and going over the edge, on top of the masking tape. Make it a tiny bit darker on the left. Picked up some burnt sienna. I've picked up a small synthetic brush now, just to lift off a little bit of the highlights while this first wash is damp. So a damp synthetic brush, and not a lot of water on it, and as I just lightly touch the surface, it's very easy to lift off that paint and it goes instantly a bit lighter. Now, because the paper is still damp, The paint may still move into those areas that I've just lifted off, which doesn't matter too much, but I just need to bear that in mind in getting the area right. Lift off some of the foreground just so that it's not all the same value. Had a bit of interest in there where maybe the light is just catching some of the debris on the ground a bit more. So I use a bigger brush there, my big mop brush, but the principles were the same. Make sure the brush is clean, it's wet, but I just squeeze out the water, just pinch out the water with my fingers to make sure there's not much water on the brush, and then just lightly touch the surface and it just brings up some of that paint. What I'm doing next is thinking about the background and then working my way forwards, thinking about the values. But first of all, in the distance, there's some quite brightly coloured, almost yellow trees in the distance. So I'm just using, this is an old mop brush, an old ox hair mop brush, and just picked up a tiny bit of yellow. The sky is still damp, so I'm going to get some soft edges here, but that yellow with a bit of the blue is going to turn green, obviously. But that will just give the impression of those lighter trees or something in the distance there that we can just see. I can just see that through the canopy of the bigger tree. Now I'm drying that just to make sure everything is dry before doing the rest of the background and the tree. If I did, or if you wanted a softer edge to the background, then I wouldn't use a hairdryer at this stage. I might just crack on with the background, trying to get a softer edge, but I'll go in with a fairly light value for the background, maybe a little bit of blue, cooler colours, cooler greens in the background, and yeah, I'll be having some harder edges on my background. But softer edge will work, creates the feeling of the heat of the area. This is a tropical climate, and so those soft edges in the background could convey that warmer feeling. I've got to make sure everything is really dry before going on to the next stage. You don't have to shake the hairdryer, but it does help. It takes a lot of abuse, that hairdryer. Okay. Next step then will be doing the background. I'm going to work from the left-hand side, being right-handed. I find that easier. And painting in these background trees. Now, the more you look at the source photo, the more things you see going on in the background. But you want to try and keep it fairly simple and not get into too much of the detail. So starting from the left-hand side, just painting around the edges of the house that will define that a little bit more. And I'm going to use my older mop brush again, this oxhair mop brush, which it keeps losing hairs out of the brush, which I don't mind. So the brush is getting a little bit smaller with time, but I find it gives some nice random marks. So now mixing up some green colour here, a yellow and a blue, and using the brush at an angle, just dragging down the brush, which I'll be using a sort of similar technique for the canopy of the main tree, but using the side of the brush so it's gently touching the paper. And if you've got rough paper, then even better. This is not, the paper I'm using is not very rough. And it's not smooth, it's in the middle. So I do get a little bit of light showing through as I drag the brush over. Ideally, I don't want there to be too much paint or too much water on the brush. So maybe not too wet, not too dry. Now the canopy of the main tree, it's got to be fairly transparent in colour, in value, so quite light, not very green, and where I've got on the edge of the canopy where there are some leaves coming out and where there's a denser twigs. So rather than painting every single twig, every single leaf, I'm just really starting from the edge of the canopy and dragging the brush in towards the middle of the tree to create these different shapes. Basically, looking at the photograph, just trying to see where there's a denser, where you can't see the sky too much. There's a denser grouping of twigs and little tiny branches and the leaves. So continue over and try not to make it too symmetrical. Quite a sort of warmish colour now. There's a little bit of a denser area in the middle of the tree, which is probably as we see it, it's in the middle. It's probably on the far side of the tree. Maybe just a few bunches of leaves just escaping beyond the canopy. Now to make a darker green for some of the background trees, I'm using Viridian here and burnt sienna, Viridian, burnt sienna, almost in equal proportions. Still sticking with that same brush, maybe just a tiny bit more water on the brush if I need to darken it a bit, use some cobalt blue or an ultramarine blue would do, and then just think about defining the edge of the side of the house. And create this foliage behind the house, but I want to try and go a bit darker towards the base of this foliage. All the way down. Paint around the balcony of the house. And then there's a little building just beyond the house and beyond the tree. So that's the top of the roof. And then on the right-hand side of the tree trunk, just continue over to the right. If I need to cool it down a bit to push the green further back, add a bit of blue to it and a bit more water to make it a weaker mix. Same technique, just dragging the brush, side of the brush, the soft brush. You could do this with a medium-sized synthetic brush as well. Just need to practice the technique, and it doesn't matter if there are little bits of the paper showing through. That can be areas of the sky showing through, or maybe distant buildings. And I've come down now to the tops of the logs, so just beginning to give them some form, some shape by painting around them, the dark colour above them. A bit more blue as I'm coming over to the middle. Some sort of distant tree. And then in the middle down to the logs, the distant log pile, and up to the left-hand edge of the sheds. First palm tree here, starting from the middle of the palm tree, just drag out these sort of radial brush marks, a bit like a firework exploding in the sky, similar to that really, but not too many fronds to the tree, and it's just a solid shape, that one in the distance. So that's the left-hand edge of the shed. Now up behind the shed, and this will give the form of the roof by painting behind the roof here. Think about the angle of that roof, just pointing down a little bit as it's going into the distance, and then up to the right hand shed. That's the side of that roof. Straighten up the line a bit. Now these three palm trees, And the more you look at these, particularly these nearby palm trees, there's different shades of green in them. I just picked up a tiny bit of yellow ochre to add in a just slight variation in the greens. But there's some darker greens, lighter greens in there. And then a smaller one just in front of that, similar technique, starting from the middle, just drag out these fronds. Not too symmetrical either. They're not perfectly round. There we are. And the taller one on the right, bit of ultramarine blue. Middle, start at the top. Leave a few little gaps between the leaves, the fronds. And then I think the lower part of the canopy on a palm tree is called the skirt, where there's these dead leaves, they dangle down and they eventually would drop off, fall to the ground. But you get these sort of dead leaves around the top part of the trunk that are almost vertical. Now, finally, the right hand, there's a sort of big tree, I guess, behind the shed here. And with these hairs sort of almost splayed out, not too much water on the brush, dragging it across the paper, hopefully we get the appearance of something that looks like foliage and a tree there, and then just create the back of that shed just with that line, light hitting the roof from above. Just a few lines going down the roof. Not sure what material it would be, maybe corrugated iron, something like that. Alizarin crimson, sorry, ultramarine blue. Just add in a darker colour. This is all still damp, just a bit of colour and a bit of variation in that green there. Tiny bit more dark in some of the palm trees. And I've lost a hair there. That's another one. Every painting I lose a few hairs out of this brush, but it doesn't matter. Eventually it will. I'll have to give it up and buy another one. I always look at when I go into artist shops or online, just look at these special offers just to see if there's any cheap brushes, particularly ox hair brushes, natural brushes, and cheap ones, and then if they're cheap enough, I can use a pair of small scissors and hack them about a bit just to remove some of those hairs. So they're very good for doing foliage. Different brush. This is a medium-sized squirrel mop from Winsor and Newton, a size 4. It's about 10 millimeters in diameter. Now, this house on the left-hand side, I'm going to paint in a few details, architectural details, some windows, balconies. But first of all, I'm going to paint in this darker shade going across the house. The more I think about it, the sun must be almost directly overhead, and there aren't too many shadows at all. Luckily, we've got the darkness in the sheds. Otherwise, there would be, and with a little bit of darkness between the logs. But apart from that, with the sun being right above us, it can be quite tricky from a watercolor point of view to get those dark shapes and silhouetted objects, which are always quite attractive in watercolor. Anyway, down to the top of the log pile, or some structure between the house and these logs on the left. Not sure what it is, some sort of covering, maybe a little roof protecting something. Now for these logs on the left, and I want to create the feeling of the curvature of the logs, and then at the bottom of the logs, they're quite dark. They're in shade. They're in shade. They're in shadow. They're in shade. Not sure which is grammatically correct. So I want like a little sort of graded wash in a way. But unlike the sky, I don't need to be too precise with this. But as long as I've got light at the top and then gradually coming darker towards the bottom of the logs, in between the logs, in a little sort of crevice, that's where it needs to be quite dark. And that will create then, so it's like I said, that the darker side of the logs, they've got a soft top edge, the darker bit, then quite a hard edge to the bottom part where it's the shadows going on over to the over the log below it, or to the side of it. So dark here, right underneath this main log. I'll call this the main log. The one I described that was almost rectangular in cross section, with the bark peeling off. So it's quite dark there. At the bottom, then repeat the process for the bottom log. A little bit of clear water at the top, and then gradually get thicker as I come down to the bottom of the log where it's on the ground, against the ground. So darker there, and less water. Neutral tint, blue. Starting at the end where it's been cut, take it up to the end. And then this one, that's this little bit of log that's pointing out, it's right below the other two, but exactly the same process. Take up the dark just to create the the form of that log, the curvature of it. Foliage on the left-hand side. You can see I've splayed out that brush and then just very lightly dragging it across the surface, we get this, the structure of that medium-sized tree or small tree on the left-hand side. Just drag it down. And it's a little bit darker towards the bottom and on the left-hand side, so I'm picking up a bit of ultramarine blue to paint the rest of the bush, coming down to the top of the logs. Now I've got a bit more of a point on this brush now, so I can be a little bit more precise with those horizontal lines, just creating a bit of form to the top of the logs, the log pile. There. And because I really don't know what's between the logs and the house, I'm keeping it fairly loose and abstract. That's that little building beyond the house. Just use my finger to lift out a little bit of paint if I think I've gone a bit too hard with a line. Now there's a darker structure above the rooftops. I'm not sure what it is exactly from the photograph, but some sort of overhang or another roof, a flat roof up there, and shadow below it. But it's creating a nice edge to the top of the light rooftop. So I'll get that in. Back with the medium mop brush and painting the sheds, which, as I've said, these are the real darks in this painting. So I want to get the value right and create a bit of impact with the contrast between the darkness inside the shed and then the light hitting the logs in front of the shed. So starting from the top, the apex of the roof, there's a horizontal support going across. So I'll just leave that unpainted for now. That I need to go in with a slightly darker colour for that horizontal beam or whatever going across. The underside of that beam over to the right hand side, and then come down to the top of the logs. But I'll leave a gap at the back because we can just see through this shed, and there's a silhouetted shape of some machinery or a saw in there. Paint around the tops those. So this is a machine, whatever it is, a timber cutting machine there, and then up the other side over to shed number 2. ultramarine blue, burnt sienna. If it's not dark enough, pick up a bit of neutral tint, not too much water on the brush, good edge to the brush to create a hard edge to the side. A little bit of light above that, just where the sun is hitting the other side of the roof that we can't see. Just left some tiny little bits of the paper unpainted. Doesn't matter, that could be something catching the light, maybe something hanging from the ceiling, light bulb or something similar like that. So this one inside here, make this a little bit different from the one on the left, but again down to the logs. Those are the planks. That's my impression of the planks. Slightly lighter colour. Something going on the right hand side. Don't know what. It's not in. We can't see that in the photo, so I'm just making it up what might be on the right hand side, but keeping it fairly simple. I don't want that to be detailed at all. Back to my smaller brush to do a little bit of detail work. Now these distant logs, similar process to the others really, just some lines to create the form of those logs, bit of debris on the ground. Connect that log pile with the pile to the left with that line. Little hole in the middle of the log and a few lines going up the length of the log, not too many. Could do those little lines with a rigger brush or a very small brush. Fortunately with this brush it's quite well worn, this brush. It did start off with a good point, but it's now got a flat edge to it, which I actually, when you get used to it, I actually use that for like a little miniature flat brush. Darken up because I think these logs have been cut some time ago, the ends have been weathered a bit, so they're a bit darker, not so light. So I'm just making them a bit darker with bit of a cool colour, just glazing over them a little bit. Just to find that shadow in the gap just a bit more. Fill in some of those bits of the paper I left where it's not needed. A few more lines up that little bit of a log showing, just sticking out. tiny bit of shadow at the top of those supports, and then just tone down that horizontal beam, glazing over it a bit of shadow, glaze over the horizontal. Some thin horizontal lines, create those planks in there. Then I need to do something with these logs on the right to create the form of those. Start off with a little bit of shadow in the gaps between the logs. Just here and there, a little dark area. This is where I think planning where these logs are going to be is very helpful. This would probably be quite difficult to do freehand, just going for it, doing some direct painting without making these marks, just planning through where these logs are going to be. It's actually quite difficult from the photo to see exactly where these logs end in the pile, so I'm really keeping it fairly loose. Another idea might be, if you're attempting this, do a Google search of log piles or timber yards or something like that, just so that you can see some images of what a pile of logs might look like. As I said, I've raised the horizon compared to the source photo, so I've got a bit more foreground. I've got the lower third of my picture is the foreground, and I think this just gives it a bit of a better balance to it. More shadow across the top, something over on the right hand side here. Don't know what it is, but just to create something over there and take it over to the right hand edge. Bottom of that log there, top of the log. So I'm varying the thickness of my lines in there and the shapes as well. Let's have a few lines. These are almost dry brush strokes here, not too much water on the brush at all, and creating that those lines to give the feeling of the tree trunk. Bit of connection of the logs to the main logs on the left to the logs in the background. Just need to, that gap that I left at the back is too bright. It's also not green. Of course, the foliage behind would be showing through, so I'm just going over the top of that light red with a bit of green to give the feeling of the whatever foliage is there behind. We can see it, but not too dark. So we've still got a bit of contrast between what's inside the shed and that foliage. Some little dark middles to some of the logs, just where it's rotted out, and create more of the form of some of those logs on the ground. There we go. Have to be careful not to overdo this, especially on the right hand side. Just a few more lines to create those right hand logs, gaps in the middle. So hopefully that colour there of these right-hand logs, it just gives the sense of the heat, the warm climate, and similar. They're very similar in colour to the ground. And what makes them stand out as logs are those shadows in the gaps and the shadow between the logs. Some brush marks just to give some texture to the ground. Not too much though. I want to keep that fairly plain. I've got that light area already where I lifted off first of all. Now, this house, I'm not going to create too much detail, but there's little bits of red in here, and I want to get in a few windows and a sense of the different levels of the house, balconies. Not too much. There's a balcony, top and bottom, a few more verticals. Now go a bit darker for some of these lines. So I've just picked up a bit of neutral tint and burnt umber. I don't often use that burnt umber. That burnt umber's been there months and months, and I don't often use it. If I did use it, it would be probably with an ultramarine blue that creates sometimes a nice cloudy sky, in my experience. Burnt umber and ultramarine blue. Right, that hut, turn that down a bit. There's a few lines going across it, going up to the left-hand side of the trunk. Now, a very important part of this picture, of course, is the tree, which I've only done so far the outside of the edge of the canopy with those lighter brush marks. Now I need to paint in the branches and the trunk. So the brush I'm using is a rigger from Lebenson, and this has a very fine point to it. I can get some very fine lines. So not too much water on the brush on this rigger, and starting from the canopy. And this is where, if you're painting this, you need to just observe that tree for a minute and look at the form of some of the branches and the direction they're going. And it's a very beautiful tree, but these branches can go in sometimes random and illogical directions. So just look for the pattern of those lines and the thickness of those lines. So very thin, obviously, at the outside of the canopy, and then these lines get a little bit thicker as they come towards the middle and joining the main trunk. Some of them make a little bit of a bend, some of them go back on themselves. I just keep checking the thickness of the brush. Sorry you can't, I'm hiding slightly what I'm doing here, but I'm just really almost in random directions creating the effect of those outside thin branches, painting little forks in the branches, connections as I'm coming down to the middle. I guess you could start with painting the main trunk first, and then almost as the tree grows, you can take the paint up and then get thinner, make the branches a bit thinner and maybe lighter as you go to the outside of the tree. I've started at the edge and work my way in. Some of these branches also will have gaps in them, so there'll be like a lost and found, where a little twig, a little branch disappears behind a bunch of foliage. Just take it up to the canopy, so halfway there. Ultramarine blue. So make him a tiny bit thicker in the middle. Another technique might be to, with a lot of paint on the brush, put a blob of paint in the middle of the canopy, the middle of the tree, and then just drag out that blob of paint using a brush, maybe a slightly drier brush, but just drag it out to the outside of the tree. That might be another technique for these trees. So you get that. So you get some nice rounded areas where the branches are connecting with each other. This is quite, actually, in this painting, this is quite an important part of it, trying to stay true to the form of the tree. As I said, I don't know what sort of tree it is. I assume it's some sort of hardwood tree, but the actual branches, they look very similar to an oak tree that you find in the northern hemisphere. When you look at a deciduous oak tree, the actual structure of these branches is very similar, and some of the branches are just weeping down, they're sort of hanging down a little bit. A few more there on the left-hand side. Over the house as well. So connecting, using these branches to connect to different elements of the painting over the background trees, painting the branches over the background trees, take the branches over the house as well, just a little bit over the house. so it's not so isolated a shape. Now, I don't want to overdo these branches, otherwise it will look a little bit overworked and a bit too congested. Back to my brush that lost its hair earlier, and I shall be doing the rest of the trunk with this one. So a smaller brush, a small mop brush, and nice and soft. The actual tree trunk is a tiny bit darker towards the top where bits of it are in the shade, but then it becomes a little bit lighter, that the tree trunk becomes a little bit lighter towards the bottom. Even with this brush, because it's lost so many hairs, I can get quite a nice point with it, so I can be creating a few more side branches. So drag it down. It's got a slight lean to it. It's not perfectly vertical. While I've got this brush, I can just strengthen up a few lines and objects as I'm going across. Maybe more vertical posts, could be lights, or I think there are a few little lamp posts in there. Maybe there's a road in the distance. Perhaps some posts there between the logs just to stabilize them, keep them together, I'd imagine. A few final little twigs. Also, those twigs could go outside of the canopy, just where maybe there aren't some leaves and that it's sort of protruding, just like that one there, protruding just beyond the outside of the edge of the tree. Drag a few down, connect that palm tree, fill in that space there. Now, if it's a little bit too dark, I can use a paper towel to lift off some of that bark colour. I just felt it was a tiny bit too dark. So while it's damp, I can press down firmly with a paper towel just to lift off a tiny bit of that paint. Do need to make the right-hand side of the trunk a little bit darker where it's in shade, in the shade. Take it down to the ground. Not sure what that white object is, but I quite like it there. It's not in the photograph, but it just accidentally left that little white, almost like a white square at the bottom of the tree trunk. Could be made into a figure, that, if I wanted to. It's got a head there already, and some lighter clothing, or it could be top of a building or shelter or something. That's what watercolor does. You sometimes get these accidental marks or objects appearing if you've gone in with a fairly large brush and try to keep loose. Then these marks sometimes make themselves apparent to you. Now I'm adding in a bit more detail to the house, some darker lines, just to help with the perspective of that building that is sort of, it's at a slight angle to us. There's another little support at the top of that shed. That's what I was painting then. Really what I'm doing now is going around with this smaller brush, just tidying things up, spotting any little minor mistakes that I could rectify with that small brush, connecting different things, maybe filling in little parts of the painting that were unpainted. These logs, I think, need a few more lines just to give them a bit more texture down the side. And then continue those lines on the left to those logs, just to maybe lead the viewer's eye in to the scene. Now, dry brush marks in that middle area. I really can't tell from the photo what's going on there, so I just have to sort of squint my eyes and add something to it. Parts of the bark is coming off, so maybe just a few lighter lines around the trunk to suggest that the curve of the log just in a few places. There's some foliage. I've just spotted some foliage sort of this side of the tree, and I'm going with some thicker light green paint there, just in a few places, just to cover up that tree trunk. Got to be careful not to make the paint too thick, otherwise it could become a little bit, I'd lose the freshness of it, really. So just a tiny bit of green there to finish up with. So as I normally do, this is the end paint, just I normally do a quick review, a quick self-critique session of my painting. Those of you on Patreon, you'll be having a go at this for the current month's project, and full instructions will be given in my posting on Patreon and in my monthly live streams that I do on Patreon as well. More information, go to patreon.com/Tim Wilmot. Those Patreon members watching this, you'll know the score, what to do. So Kerala then, a timber yard, sawmill, tropical area, southwest state of India, and this lovely majestic tree here, the canopy of it, the beautiful lace-like structure of the branches and the twigs in the canopy, the left-hand building. Not so sure about that building. Maybe I could have kept it a bit plainer, not so detailed, gone a bit more. Perhaps I could have gone a bit more solid with the leaves on the left-hand side there. Background, keep it cool, keep it light in value, not too green as well. Probably that tree there, especially that little left-hand that little bit there. It's probably a good colour to achieve in the background. These coconut palm trees, not overdone. Try and keep it nice and fresh. Just a few lines for the fronds coming out from the middle of the canopy, and that kind of stroke that I did from the middle going out to the side of the canopy. Maybe a few more fronds, older fronds there, and then the trunk coming out to the bottom. So that was my technique for those, and maybe a little bit of a darker colour. While it's still damp, just dab in a little bit of darker colour, particularly on those palm trees that are closer to us. Tree trunks, not a solid line. An old brush, thin brush, maybe even a rigger brush would work as well. Right-hand foliage. Let me just... Oh, that's the right hand. Can't go any further on the right. But dry brush marks, done quite quickly. Darker values to create the form of the lighter objects in front of them, like that. This roof here. So I turned that shed. We were sort of almost looking dead on the front of those sheds. So I took the liberty of just twisting them a little bit so that we can see this lighter area. And the darkness within the inside of the sheds, and maybe some sort of machinery on that left hand one, and then the right hand one, maybe some planks or something in there. Add some shadows, to some lighter shadows from the top, and then coming down to these logs. Quite tricky, these logs, trying to get them right. Not sure if I achieved that on the right hand side here, but certainly, well, I think they look like logs. You'll be the judge. You'll be another judge of that. Thinking about with these logs, creating the form of a log pile by that, as I pointed out in the source photo, that kind of shape within these gaps. Maybe some of them a little dark mark in the middle. Some of them have got a few lines going down the length of the log. Darker shadow on the ground, and those on the... Oh, we had those middle logs, which I just kept really simple. I just couldn't tell from the photograph what was going on there. But maybe we can sense there's another pile of logs down there. But the main ones I had to get right, and I think they look okay. These ones on the left, not perfectly circular logs in the cross section of the logs, and thinking about a small little graded wash, so light at the top, then going a little bit darker and thicker as we come to the bottom of that log, and soft edge here, hard edge here. All right, as the sun is coming, the sun is almost directly above us. And maybe a few dry brush marks just to, at the end, one is dry, just a few dry brush marks to create more of the texture of the bark on that log. So I think that worked all right. Foreground, very simple, but not all the same value, just a few little lighter areas. I lifted off this lighter patch after laying down the wash while it was still moist and damp with a big mop brush, just to make that a little bit lighter. Yeah, I'm quite pleased with the colours as well. The sky, kept that nice and flat, or graded wash, lighter down to the horizon, nice and dark at the top. Combination of a bit of cerulean blue and lavender. And the tree itself, use of a rigger brush to do that tree. Well, first of all, almost the dry brush marks, starting from the canopy, going in towards the middle, creating that the effect of the foliage, not too dense, the foliage, and we can see the branches going through, but then the branches, the shape of those, not perfect. Branches crossing each other, branches in a curve, branches in a straight line. and some branches going outside of the canopy and then going into, oops, let's just zoom in, and then go into the actual trunk itself. Kept that quite simple, a little bit light down towards the bottom where the sunlight is reaching that. Bit darker perhaps on the right hand side because it's leaning over to the right, so I think there would be a darker shadow there on the right. So good luck with that then. Those of you on Patreon, you'll have the full details of how to approach this and some extra hints and tips for you. Say go to patreon.com/Tim Wilmot if you want to get involved and participate. But thanks for watching, and catch up with you on the next video. Cheers.